more and more people realize that we're living in a science fiction world, and that the notion that people who look into the future and see astonishing things are crazy is itself crazy. Unless we see astonishing things when we look into the future, we're going to be in deep trouble because we're not going to be prepared for the future. Right now, the rate of change is so enormously fast that even young people can see it taking place in their lifetimes, day to day, year to year, enormous change. And that makes them realize that the world in which they will be middle-aged and helping to run will be nothing at all like the world in which they're going to school and learning. I feel that if people who are afraid of the future simply don't look at it, they look the other way. In fact, they look towards the past. There's a lot of these good old days. Why can't we return to the good old days? Why can't people be the way they used to be? Why can't we live more simply? Why can't we eat natural foods? Why can't we get rid of the automobile? And so on. This is what happens when people are afraid of the future. I'm not saying that it isn't justifiable to be afraid of the future, because the future is probably a very unpleasant one. But if we turn our backs on the future and consume our energies and our efforts in dreaming of a long gone past which won't come back, then we're making it certain that the future is going to be unpleasant. If we want a future that's tolerable, the only thing we can do is look forward into the future, try to figure out what's going to happen if we don't do anything, and what we ought to do to change that if we don't like it. In fact, science fiction is the only form of literature which accepts as its basic premise the fact of the inevitability of change and tries on different changes for size. And more, this is exactly what people must do.
How did you get started in science fiction?
That's almost too long ago to remember. I started reading science fiction when I was 9 years old, and I read it steadily for years. And like all young people who read science fiction avidly, the feeling arose that I ought to write science fiction. And I started writing at the age of 11, but not with any feeling I ought to publish. Finally, when I was 18 years old, I actually took the step of writing a short story and trying to submit it. I did submit it, and it was rejected instantly. And I wrote another short story, and finally, 4 months to the day after my first submission was on June 17th, 1938. On October 17th, 1938, I sold a story for the first time. It was the third story I had written for submission, and it appeared in the March 1939 issue of Amazing Stories. The title of the story was Marooned on Vesta. The story is about two guys who are wrecked. No, as a matter of fact, three guys. Three guys who are wrecked on a spaceship that was hit with an asteroid when it went through the asteroid belt. And they're quite close to the asteroid Vesta. And the trick is to get down to Vesta safely and save their lives. And of course, our hero does it.
How did it feel selling the first story?
It was great. I got a check for $64, and I used to pay the dentist on some dental work I had to have in those days. And then I sold more stories, and I used it to pay my tuition at school. Put myself through school with this.
On your writing?
Yes. I'm sort of glad everything happened the way it did, because I got into science fiction on the ground floor. I began writing when it consisted of 3 magazines that nobody paid any attention to. They were considered just pulp magazines, and among the lower rung of the pulp magazines too, so that I was able to get stories published at a time when I was still a crude and apprentice writer.
But the medium was also.
That's right, that's right. Of course, they were also crude in the way of payments. It took my first 11 years of writing, all 11 years put together, as a successful science fiction writer, because I was one of the most successful in those 11 years, I made $7,700 in all 11 years. But that was perfect. If I had made more money than that, I might have been tempted to go into writing completely and never have finished my schooling and never have gotten my background in science that I now have. If I'd made less money than that, I might have given up. So it was just enough to keep me writing and not enough to keep me from becoming a scientist as well. So that was perfect. And I grew with the medium, and now that the medium is important, I'm important too. And in fact, I have become an elder statesman which is sort of peculiar at my young age. I've become an elder statesman in science fiction, and I am looked up to not only in science fiction, but outside of science fiction too. I don't know that I enjoy being recognized in the street. I sort of value my anonymity. I like to have my books recognized, my name recognized. For me, I like to sort of slink around unnoticed. However, I am more and more being recognized in the street, and I just have to adjust to that too. But I'm happy. By looking back at my career, I wouldn't have changed anything. It worked out perfectly.
What works do you consider your own favorites? What works are you really proud of?
My favorite short story is The Last Question, which was published in '57.
What was that about, The Last Question?
Oh, that was a history of the human race from beginning to end. Trillions upon, yes, 5,700 words. Trillions and trillions of years. Also the concomitant development of computers. And it ends up with a real sacco ending like you never saw. It appears, I would tell you what the plot is in detail, but it appears in two of my books. One is called Nine Tomorrows, the other is called The Best of Isaac Asimov, and I would just love to have people buy those books. So I'll just rouse their curiosity and send them out. My favorite novel is The Gods Themselves, which was published in '73, I believe.
Told the same story from the viewpoint of Earth and people on Earth and the Moon, and then from the viewpoint of a different race of creatures in another dimension.
That's right. Originally, when I wrote that first story, there was another universe, and there were intelligences in the other universe, but I didn't introduce them. Now, the first part posed a problem and did not pose the solution. So then in the second part, I went into the other universe and created a bunch of extraterrestrials who are really extraterrestrials, and not just human beings with antennae. And I posed the same problem, and again I didn't solve it. Then I went to the moon and posed the same problem, and this time I solved it. And it was very good, especially the second part, in which I think I was writing over my head.
I was very impressed with that. You created the entire culture, sexual life of this alien race of people.
Well, I tell you, I was a little impressed with it too. What happened was that very few of my stories ever have non-human characters, extraterrestrial characters. Even my Foundation trilogy, which deals with an entire galaxy, they're all human beings. Human beings are the only intelligences in the galaxy. They settled all the worlds. And the rumor went around that the reason I dealt exclusively with human beings was that I didn't have enough imagination to think up extraterrestrial beings. So I thought I'd show them.
And you did,
I did. The old man showed him he still had it. There also, very few of my stories have any sex whatsoever. Very little romance and no sex. Not because I don't know anything about sex, because believe me, I do, but because I'm naturally pure. And everyone said that wasn't it. They said it's because I didn't know anything about sex.
So you decided
So I showed them. And I combined the extraterrestrials with sex. The entire second part consists of nothing but sex. Everything hinges on the sex.
Probably X-rated off in their world.
Yeah, that's the point. If we were in the other universe, then the book would be X-rated. But since we're in this universe, it's only fascinating.
You mentioned the Foundation trilogy. It's probably, I guess, one of your best-known works. Could you say a little more about that?
Sure. The Foundation trilogy is a collection of shorter pieces which were written over a space of 8 years for astounding science fiction. Okay. And then in 51, 52, and 53, they were collected into 3 books called Foundation, Foundation and Empire, Second Foundation, and then eventually into a single triple volume called Foundation Trilogy. And it's essentially a historical novel of the future. In other words, it deals with a history, I don't know, tens of thousands of years into the future, but told from the standpoint still further into the future, looking back and treating it as the past. And it was voted in 1966 as the best novel series of all time, got a Hugo as a result, and it's still my best known science fiction. When I wrote my Foundation trilogy, I had actual history completely in mind. I had read The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. I knew it quite well, and what I wrote was very much a decline and fall of the Galactic Empire. So that I make no secret of the fact that in writing of the future, I am guided by the past. I think it's the only way you can be. As far as fiction that isn't science fiction is concerned, my favorite is called Murder at the ABA, which is a murder mystery published earlier this year. Even when I was writing science fiction, I tended to veer towards the mystery. The Caves of Steel and The Naked Sun, two of my science fiction novels, are also perfectly orthodox mysteries, perfect fusions of science fiction and mystery. And just to show you how modest I am, nobody can do it as well as I can. And then I have the impulse to just write the mysteries too, so I've written a series of short stories for Ellery Queen and other magazines, and I put them together in two books called Tales of the Black Widowers and More Tales of the Black Widowers. And in nonfiction, my favorite book is Asimov's Guide to Shakespeare. My favorite scientific book is Asimov's Guide to Science. And I've written, my favorite history book, I suppose, is Birth of the United States. And my favorite humor book is Lecherous Limericks. Here's the most recent limerick I wrote that I think is funny. There was an old fellow of Michigan who said, "How I wish I were rich again. But each time I'm ahead, I fall into the bed of that rotten old gold-digging bitch again."